Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to give a very warm welcome to Madeleine Albright, former U.S. Secretary of State, and to my dear friend Mack McLarty, former White House Chief of Staff. It is a great pleasure to have you both with us today. Thank you so much for being here. This is a very timely conversation as we look to the next 4 years. It is a huge opportunity for President Biden to work with our hemispheric partners. He knows Latin America very well from both his days in the Senate and his days as Vice President. So without further ado, because we only have an hour, I will now give the floor to Eric Farnsworth, our Vice President of the Council of the Americas in Washington, D.C. Eric, the floor is yours.
Susan, thank you very much for that warm welcome and getting us going. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Council of the Americas and American Society for what promises to be a really interesting conversation today with two of the best known practitioners of the diplomatic arts in the hemisphere and the world today, former U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and former White House Chief of Staff Thomas Mack McLarty. As Susan mentioned, my name is Eric Farnsworth, and it's both a professional and personal privilege to have the opportunity to conduct our conversation today, which will be on the record. We're delighted to welcome a wide and diverse audience from literally around the world, and those participating via WebEx will have an opportunity later in the program to ask questions via the chat function. If you send your question directly to me as the presenter, I'll be happy to add that into the queue. Our conversation today is a serious one, the impulse arising from the tragic events in the United States with the sacking of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. The shocking pictures were seen worldwide in real time by millions and subsequently by billions of people, many of whom likely believed that things like this could only happen to other countries, not the United States. But we just have to open the newspaper, and yes, we still have newspapers, or even more convincingly, to glance at social media to see that democracy is being challenged around the world perhaps more consequentially than at any time since the 1930s. And since the post-war era, the world has looked to the United States to stand for democratic practice and ideals as the center pole holding up the circus tent, so to speak, and to lend active support to those engaged on the front lines worldwide. So where do we go from here? Is it all now in the past? How has the democracy promotion agenda been affected by the events of the last 2 months and longer? What things can and must the Biden administration do to recapture the global commanding heights on these issues? And what does all of this mean for U.S. policy toward Latin America and the Caribbean, where the democracy agenda has been foundational at least since the first Summit of the Americas in 1994? To discuss these and other issues, we have two of the most interesting and accomplished people in Washington. Their bios are well known. They are featured frequently in top media. They literally need no introduction. In fact, giving introductions they deserve would occupy the balance of our time this afternoon. With that in mind, let me just highlight a couple points. Madeleine Albright is the chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group and Albright Capital Management. In 1997, she became the then highest ranking woman in the history of the United States government when she became the first female Secretary of State, serving with distinction in that position for the balance of the second Clinton administration. She's a professor, diplomat, and businesswoman, and the author of numerous bestsellers, including her most recent Fascism, A Warning. She chairs the National Democratic Institute, and it is a real pleasure to welcome her back to the Council, where she spoke several times as Secretary of State. Mack McLarty is chairman of McLarty Associates. As White House Chief of Staff, he was literally at the right hand of President Clinton and was a critically important voice in advancing signature initiatives, including NAFTA, APEC, and the Uruguay round of trade talks, as well as much domestic legislation. As a longtime businessman who just knows how to get things done, he also served as an effective troubleshooter, getting the Summit of the Americas back on track, and later serving as special envoy for the Americas, which is where I worked with him. And now he's still my boss of a sort, as a longtime director of the Council. What a privilege to welcome him back to the Council today as well. Ladies and gentlemen, if we were in person, we'd ask you to join us in welcoming our speakers to the Council of the Americas. We'll have to do that virtually, and we ask that you would do that. Madam Secretary, let's begin our conversation with you. We see our own challenges. You've written about some of them, and we're all aware of them. And these are complications, to be sure. What can you tell us to get us going about the state of democracy globally, and where do we stand as of today? Mute, please.
Muted? Okay. I love being here with my very good friend, Mack McLarty. We have worked together a lot, and it's terrific to be able to do this. And I thank you for your first question, because it is a very hard time. And I hate to say this, but democracy is not in good shape at the moment. There are a variety of studies and task forces looking at this. And basically what is agreed is that since the beginning of this millennium, the majority of the world is not living in free countries with democracies. And I think that is a very difficult statement for all of us. And part of the issue, and the part that I find very hard to accept, is that the U.S. has not been a great example at the moment, and that has also given us a lot of problems. I would like to say, just so people know about myself, I'm an immigrant. I came to this country when I was 11 years old. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and he didn't want to live under communism. And so we were able to come to the United States. My father defected and got political asylum and went and lived in Denver. And I'll never forget what he said, is that the American people need to know that democracy is fragile, but it's resilient. And I think we're seeing that in so many ways. I do think we have gone through some interesting eras. I think Mack and I have in common that we worked in the 90s in the White House and in the State Department, and I at the United Nations. And with the end of the Cold War, there really was a burgeoning of new democracies. And I think that people felt that this was going to be a permanent growth, and the United States was the best example of it, the beacon of democracy. And yet what has been shown is democracy is much harder than we think, that there are always various threats. And I think in the last few years, it has been particularly under threat. And we have to deal with that because it is evident all over the world. And so I think the U.S. Is very important. One of the things that President Biden said, that it is the power of our example that needs to be more important than just the example of our power. And so we are at a time where we have to show how democracy is in fact resilient, that despite some hard times in the last few years, that we understand that compromise is not a four-letter word, that it's important to kind of build coalitions, and that democracy is not a spectator sport. And so I think we'll have plenty of time to kind of talk about various parts, but I do think you told me, you said I'd written this book called Fascism, A Warning. And when I wrote it, I really did think it was important to give a warning, because fascists, it is not an ideology. It is a way for gaining power. And it builds on divisions in society where a leader exacerbates them by aligning himself with one group at the expense of another. And the best quote in the book actually comes from Mussolini, who said, "If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices." So there has been a lot of feather plucking all over the world. And we're now basically seeing a pretty bald chicken.
Well, I have to say, Madam Secretary, I did not anticipate us talking about plucked chickens today, and, but the visual is compelling. Thank you for that and getting us going so well. Mack, to you, you've been a longtime observer practitioner in the Western Hemisphere. You know, when we were promoting the first Summit of the Americas in Miami, we used to hold up these colored graphs about democracy from the 1960s in the hemisphere, and then where democracy stood in the hemisphere in 1994, totally different to the upside. I wonder if we could hold those same pictures up today, what we would find. What are your impressions about where the hemisphere has gone, and what would you advise for some of us who are watching the issues carefully?
Well, Eric, I'll be glad to comment on that and give you my best thoughts. But first, let me acknowledge and say that it's a real joy to be with Susan Siegel, who is a dear friend. Susan has taken the Council of the Americas, where I've been privileged to be a board member for many, many years now, and really raised it, lifted to a different profile, a different level in the spirit of David Rockefeller, and that just makes us all feel proud and good, and I don't think the Council has ever been more relevant. And of course, Eric, you've been a big part of that. I take personal pride in that, given our work together in the White House. We traveled, I think, 52 times to Latin America in a 2.5-year period during our responsibilities in the White House, working with Secretary Albright. So I'm delighted to be with you today. Following Madeleine Albright is a little bit like following Joe DiMaggio in the batting order. That's not exactly where you want to be. Madeleine's always so engaging, substantive, thoughtful, and she, of course, has that just ability to just lift a conversation or discussion to the best level, and she's already demonstrated that today. Madeleine and I have traveled many miles together. We were actually announced together beginning our journey in the Clinton administration at the old State House in Little Rock, Arkansas, with Madeleine's family and our family there. So we began our journey together and just have so many rich memories, but also a feeling that Madeleine made a enduring contribution both during her time and continues to do so in her role. So Madeleine, it's just a delight and an honor to be with you today.
Yeah.
Eric, building on what you said, let me kind of take a step back. I really commend you for not only the way you set the table, but framing our discussion today in terms of democracy and how it relates to the region and the United States. Very, very timely, very serious. I think history always judges a presidency leadership, be it in the United States, Latin America, or around the world, by the basic standards of peace and security. I think particularly after 9/11, security it's got that slash between peace and prosperity. That is, are we on the right track or the wrong track? Are we making lives better for the people that we're privileged to serve or not? And in that case, I think, unfortunately, Secretary Albright put it forward in very objective, candid terms, that there are some legitimate, serious concerns and issues, both in the region and globally, about the state and sustainability of democracy. You used to have a phrase you often put in speeches that we gave, making democracy work. And that really goes back to the kind of the centerpiece of lifting lives. But I do think Secretary Albright's reference to fragility and resiliency is directly relevant to the new administration and to President Biden. I think we will see and are already seeing a return to really institutional leadership, principled leadership and engagement. I think Secretary Blinken's speech, major speech that he gave today, laid that out in a very comprehensive, thoughtful, depthful manner. So hopefully what we can move to is a real understanding that geography is important. We don't have the luxury, and we would be so unwise not to view Latin America, the region, Central America, the Caribbean, and our neighbors to the north, Canada, who are now part of the Western Hemisphere, at least at the State Department, building on the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA. We would really be making a serious mistake not to prioritize our relationships within the region and engage. And I believe if we do that, we will see a response, and a positive response broadly. Won't be perfect, won't be a straight line, but we clearly have shared interest, shared values largely, and we need to adopt and work on a shared vision going forward. That is important from a government standpoint, both here and around the region, but it's also critically important from a private sector standpoint and from organizations like the Council of the Americas, NGOs, academia, and so forth. So I would just simply conclude before we get to our discussion conversation, which I'm very much looking forward to, that to be strong abroad, we've got to first be strong at home. And I think President Biden has made that clear, along with Vice President Harris. We're living in unprecedented and challenging times with the coronavirus. We've got to move through that, and I hope and pray and believe that we are. But I would also say the other bookend, as Secretary Albright knows so well, in order to stay strong at home, we've got to be engaged abroad. Those are the bookends. And I think that will serve us well in the coming months and years in Latin America. And I am hopeful in that regard while not minimizing some of the challenges and complications ahead.
Mack, extraordinarily well stated as always. Thank you for that. Thank you both for framing the conversation so well. And let me build up on that last point, Mack, that you just made and return to Secretary Albright. Both of you have been watching these issues for so long and working on them and leading efforts. But there does seem to be a sense in Latin America and around the world that something's changed, not just in the United States, but broadly. I wonder if you could, Madam Secretary, give us a sense of, from your position, what's changed? Why is it more complicated these days to promote democracy? And how then can the United States do frankly, a better job in promoting democracy around the world, as Mack indicates that we really need to be doing?
Well, let me just say that promoting democracy has been one of my life's work. I am chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, which was an organization started by Ronald Reagan. He had spoken in London and at the parliament, and he'd said that democracies were not real good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. So he came back and he started the Endowment for Democracy that has a Democratic Institute, a Republican one, business and labor, the warp and woof of our country. And the truth is that you can't impose democracy on anybody. That's an oxymoron. And so the question is, what are really the environment that is welcoming to democracy? And it's when people, I have believed always that we're all the same, that we want to be able to make decisions about our own lives. And whether it's first where you live and send your children to school, or how you feel about your neighborhood, but ultimately you want to have something to do with how your country is run. And I never like when people say, well, X country has no sense of democracy, the people, but I do think you say make democracy work. I have said democracy has to deliver because people want to vote and eat. And so the point is how to have economic situation which does not divide people, but provides for their livelihood. And then that there are countries that do have governments that are representative, that respond to the needs of the people, and that there are elections, that there are institutional structures that provide for the rule of law, and also make sure that it's clear that corruption is the cancer of democracy. But it's not easy, and I think that we need to recognize that it's not easy. I do think it doesn't matter what part of the world one looks at, but the bottom line is that we have a big challenge in this hemisphere. And by the way, Mack said, the most revolutionary thing I ever did was when I was Secretary of State, was to bring Canada into the Western Hemisphere. Because according to the State Department, I was in Europe. And they are in the Western Hemisphere. But one of the reasons that I did it was because we wanted a strong democracy along with us in the hemisphere. And I would say I'm not an expert on this hemisphere, but I traveled there a lot in a number of places. And I have to say, I admire what Mack and you have done, because our policies towards Latin America are a little bit damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't pay any attention, they're rightfully irritated. And if you get too much involved in telling them what to do, they're also irritated. And so it really does take deft diplomacy, and it does take what I think we're about to see is a president who has actually been there. Biden as vice president, I think, gone 16 times. He has spoken about the importance of this hemisphere and democracy. He understands the problem of immigration, but doesn't blame everything on that. But I do think that we are in a position now to really look at what the issues are, work with the countries, and see what they have to say. And I do think that having Canada as a partner in this is going to make a difference. But even more, it's a matter of not being patronizing or deliberately being rude or whatever, because if you look at the situation in the hemisphere now, in Latin America, is that the situation, the COVID virus has been particularly damaging there, and their economic situation is, I think, slightly improving, but not in such great shape. And there are those leaders, demagogic leaders, who like to take advantage of the economic situation and the division. So I think President Biden and his team have his work cut out for them. And the things that you're doing with the council are just absolutely essential. And I think having the private sector involved with the public sector is also a very important part of this.
It's almost like we coordinated these comments, because your comments are such a perfect segue to where I want to go with Mack. But first, to say that the Canadians have been a terrific partner for democracy promotion in the Western Hemisphere, indeed globally. So very spot on comments, and thank you for that. And Mack, building on what the Secretary just said, look, democracy must deliver. And the Western Hemisphere is in ferment right now. We've mentioned COVID, economic development, all kinds of interesting things. Give us your sense as a practitioner on these issues. What are some of the things that the United States really should be considering right now to help build out the agenda for the Western Hemisphere in a manner so that the people of the region do sense that democracy is delivering, and therefore become even more supportive of the concept going forward?
Well, I think we have to be honest and state really what's clearly before us, and that is COVID-19 has really had a crushing impact on the region, certainly on our country. I mean, it's a seminal event of my lifetime in terms of just disrupting life and health and the economy. So we've got to remember we're still in that period and not quite able to move forward in a manner that we would all like. Having said that, I really think the first step is to truly have a vision, have a plan to engage with the region, recognizing first it is not a monolithic region. Latin America is much like our country here, except only more diverse and more geographically spread. You've got different interfaces with different countries individually and different regions. Mexico is obviously part of the North American continent with Canada, major trading partner, major issues because of their proximity and size. The Andean region has a particular set of issues, including Venezuela, but you've got other major countries there, with Colombia being somewhat of a linchpin. You've got Brazil being the large force in Latin America with the Southern Cone. You've got the smaller countries in the Caribbean, and you have Central America, which is also a region, area that has to be understood and worked with. So that's number one. Number two, I think that we do have some programs already in place that we need to move forward on. We don't have to pass brand new trade laws and all of that. We need to really mobilize, energize the private sector has a huge role to play here with a market, a neighbor, both ways. Supply chains, particularly with China, that supply chains have become even more important. That is reinforcing of employment here in the United States if it's done correctly. And I think President Biden is very clear-eyed in that regard about how to approach that. You've got the Department or Development Finance Corporation that has money to lend, put to work. We've already got some resources, but we've got to be, I think, honest. We are somewhat constrained in terms of financial resources at this point in time. But that is not a reason, much less an excuse, not to work the problem, work the region, show the flag, engage, and do it, as Secretary Albright said. Clearly, we've got to develop a sense of confidence, but also humility in the way we approach the region, a sense of genuine respect and understanding, and that hopefully will build a level of trust. And that's how you move forward and get things done. And so that, I think, is well within the ability of this administration to really get started in a serious way. And I think you'll have also cabinet members that will logically, naturally be engaged. I would think the Secretary of Commerce with Governor Raimondo really understands that. I know Gina well, favorably. I think she'll do an outstanding job, frankly, following somewhat the model Secretary Pritzker set when she was Secretary of Commerce. Secretary Vilsack at Agriculture will have a lot of issues that will intersect. And Tom is a very experienced, capable leader, again, a former governor. So I think you'll have some natural reinforcement at the cabinet level, as well in Congress, with Greg Meeks being chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House. I think Bob Menendez, while he has some specific issues that he'll focus on, he understands the region, as does Senator Rubio from Florida. And I think two other senators, Eric, that will play a key role here, particularly in Central America, which is so important on the immigration issue, are Senator Tim Kaine, who speaks fluent Spanish, and Senator John Cornyn from Texas, who has worked with Senator Kaine on a bipartisan basis. So there's ways here to catalyze and get started and get things moving in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a reminder to folks, to the extent you want to join our conversation, we'll have that opportunity in just a couple minutes. Send a direct chat to me, which is the presenter on your screen, and I will add you to the queue. So, Mack, let me come back to you and then return to Secretary Albright. But, you know, it almost sounds as if you're saying that we have all of the tools already available. We just need to use them better. And frankly, I would agree with that. But from the perspective of the private sector, you know, the United States has a different model than an authoritarian government like China. We can't tell the private sector where to go, where to invest, where to trade. So it's of deep interest to the Council of the Americas and our constituents, of course. And the question would be, how do we then generate some of that enthusiasm from the private sector to view Latin America and the Caribbean in this way? So that we see the opportunities there and we aren't always seized by all the obstacles and challenges.
Well, you're right, and I don't want to leave the impression that I'm seeing this through rose-colored glasses.
No, not at all.
Optimistic. I want to be very. I try to be very level and balanced in my comments. But I do think, and we may not have all the programs we would like, but we certainly have some. But I think from the private sector standpoint, I do think that if the leadership beginning in the Oval Office sets a marker, puts down a marker, sets a tone about the importance of our relationships in the region, and then our government engages in that, I think the private sector will follow because I think there's natural opportunities there. Now, one leadership that has not been mentioned, I think it's important too, actually. The governors have already discovered Latin America, Eric. They see the job creation, they see the connectivity, they see the investment, they see the growing Latino population in our country. So that's a very rich area and natural area of leadership. Also, as Secretary Albright certainly knows so very well and was a great champion of it during her time as Secretary of State. We need to get our ambassadors in place in the region. That sends a very positive, strong signal, as Susan Siegel and others know, to the region, and that will help stimulate business and U.S. commerce engagement in the region. So those are some of the tangible things I think we can do. But Eric, you've written a lot about it. Just to finish this up quickly, it is a very different Latin America than what you and Secretary Albright and I, when we had the privilege to serve in government, interfaced with. But also, we've got to recognize we do have competition with China, who is certainly well-funded, with Russia, meddling mischievously and worse. But there is we have the pole position. This is a natural friendship ally in Latin America. It's ours to lose. We are fully capable of losing it. Let's not do that. Let's engage and win it.
Yeah, I think you had an analogy that you used to use quite a lot about selling a car. You don't want to go across town to sell a car and miss the sale right next door to your neighbor. And I think that remains relevant today more than ever. So,
yeah, and our son Mark, our older son, who lived and worked in Latin America, as well as our younger son Franklin, is aware of it as well. We're generational in the automobile business, and that's where that came from. But Mark understands the region firsthand, having lived and worked there. Let me cede the floor to the secretary here.
Well, and just to say, I wanted to extend that commentary just a little bit, because as a business person, as well as Secretary Albright as a business person, you're seeing these issues through commercial lenses as well, not just political and economic lenses. So thank you for being willing to extend those comments. And Madam Secretary, let's return to you. You have written and said many times that the United States is the indispensable nation. I actually firmly believe that to be the case. And I've supported that sort of formulation for a long time. And I wonder, in that context, in the democracy promotion context, if the United States itself is challenged, how do we recapture this? To put it in the vernacular, how do we recapture our mojo on the democracy promotion agenda? If we are indeed the indispensable nation, that's a pretty serious issue, no? And how do we move beyond that?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, our boss is the first one to use the word indispensable nation. I've just said it so often that it became identified with me. But there's nothing about the word that says alone. Mm-hmm. And I think the best way to talk about it is partnership. And it's not just us going in and telling everybody what to do all the time. The problem is when we're AWOL, as we have been, because then you were talking about the Russians and the Chinese. It's certainly clear in Latin America in terms of what they've been doing while we've been doing something else. So I think we are going to be welcomed back. However, we have to do it with humility and understanding that we don't have everything exactly right. And the fact that we have gone through problems, I think if you put it on a human scale, it sometimes actually helps if you can identify with those that have had also. You can't say everything we've done is perfect, now we're telling you what to do. That we can say that we have gone through a pretty tough patch ourselves. So I think that can be put forward in a impressive and positive way. I think also that what is going to be necessary is to understand how different all countries are from each other, but they certainly are. You can't just say Latin America and just think everybody is the same. And to really get an understanding of what is going on in each of the countries and have some problem solving there. But the part that I'd like to really get back to is the whole concept of public-private partnerships. I think it may terrify people to think that once you're Secretary of State, you're actually learning something. You're supposed to know it. So what happened was I got invited out to Silicon Valley by John Chambers from Cisco, saying, come and tell my people, why the government is important to them. And they said, well, the government can't help us. And I said, that's ridiculous. You need the government to do, market access and deal with regulations. And then I would go somewhere and give a speech and I would learn nothing. And so I decided that what I wanted to do was to meet with the representatives of our corporations that were abroad at a roundtable. And they could tell me more about what was going on in the country than some of the diplomats. And so I came back to the department and I established a prize for American corporations that were good local citizens. So the important part at this point is, as we look on how to deal with the issues, whether it's in Brazil or Colombia or Venezuela, the important part is to have the private sector at the table at the beginning, not to bring them in just when you need to have something paid for, but to kind of have them understand the issues and have them see themselves as locals in that country, and then know that what we are doing is trying to help on developing rule of law and a commercial code and a variety of different aspects. And Mack, we need to get our ambassadors. I mean, our ambassadors really are the ones that project what America's about and welcome the eyes and ears and welcome people and try to put those kinds of meetings together where the private sector, and the private sector, by the way, is both corporations, but also obviously non-governmental organizations. And that broadens the whole picture and provides a way for dealing with actual issues instead of being too kind of theoretical.
Absolutely. And, the first question we'll take from the floor really builds on what you just said, Madam Secretary, and also you, Mack. I mean, when you bring the private sector in from the United States and Western countries, Canada, Europe, Japan, you're bringing also a values set, aren't you, in terms of anti-corruption and respect for the environment and such. The question, therefore, has to do with China. And perhaps both of you might offer some views on this. You know, the entrance of China into the Western Hemisphere is one of the most dramatic, if not the most dramatic, shifts in hemispheric relations in this century. And the question is, does this reduce U.S. leverage? But what would you recommend for the United States to do based on where the scenario is today with Chinese interests and activities? How would you advise the United States to react or not to some of these issues going forward? Madam Secretary, perhaps to you first and then to Mack.
Well, I think we do need to explain, and it's hard to do when you're there because it sounds like you're kind of, providing excuses for yourself. But the Chinese have a way of going in and saying, where do you want the road, or we'll sell your oil or take your oil. And then all of a sudden, they have imported a lot of workers. And they are not going to finish what they're doing, and the country is known as in the debt trap. They will have not gotten what they want. I think that the hard part, and I think I have to say it frankly, when we look disorganized and hopeless and don't know what to do in terms of helping other countries solve problems in a humane way, we lose out. And I think we need to make clear that we want to involve the population, that we believe that everybody has it's important to be able to make a living, not to be told what to do, but to be able to have some choice. But I think the initial part of this is not easy, because the Chinese come and say, we go somewhere and we say, you've got to have this kind of environmental law, or labor regulations, and then the Chinese just say, where do you want this road? So we have to figure out how to be more competitive in terms of explaining our value system. The Chinese have this Belt and Road policy. I've been saying the Chinese must be getting very fat because the belt is larger and larger all the time. And I think we do need to make our value system clearer to those people that want to be able to have a life where they can make decisions and be able to show their expertise and their willingness to have a better country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mack, to you, shared values and common interests, does that still pertain to the Western Hemisphere?
I think it does if we make that help make that a reality. I think, frankly, there's no question that the Chinese rise of China and their engagement around the world, specifically discussing Latin America today is a significant paradigm shift from when we were in government in the 90s. And we would be foolish in really sticking our heads in the proverbial sand if we don't recognize that. So we've got a strong competitor. We've always had competitors, but we've got a strong competitor. We are capable, fully capable, of winning this game. Or competition. We've got the pole position, as I noted earlier, and that is that there's much more of a natural connectivity of shared values, trust, history with the United States than with China. But if we don't show up and compete, pretty obvious what the outcome is going to be. We've got to offer a clear, viable, strong, workable alternative. And if we don't do that, we will not be successful. We've got a lot of tools to do it. I don't think it's just about money and investment, particularly under the terms that Madeleine suggested that I think are pretty well recognized around the world. That's just kind of how the Chinese model is built, and that's their playbook. And I'm not going to pass judgment on that today. But we've got a much better relationship playbook, but we've got to fully engage. And if we don't, we will simply not be successful over time. And that is not good for the region, and it's not good for our country. That goes back to the priorities of the administration and the private sector as well.
Yeah, you both mentioned the private sector clearly and effectively, and thank you for doing that. And again, our constituency is very interested in those issues, right. So very appropriate comments. A question has come in from Fidel Garza about Mexico. It's country specific. We don't necessarily want to get into a roll call of countries in the Western Hemisphere, but Mexico is fundamental to the United States activities in the Western Hemisphere. We're aware, of course, of the virtual meeting that the two presidents just conducted. I wonder if you would have any thoughts of a general nature of how to promote an effective relationship with Mexico during these current moments. Perhaps, Mack, we start with you, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot. This is a more of a general question than going to what the topic of conversation was to be.
Well, the U.S.-Mexico relationship is a critical one, Eric, just to go right to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
They are a large neighbor on our border. They are a major trading partner. We've got a growing Hispanic population in the United States. We certainly have the issue of immigration. We've got a lot of other issues there because of proximity and size. So I think it seemed to me that the first engagement between President Biden and President Lopez Obrador went pretty well. It was a good start. It will be good to get a good ambassador in Mexico, U.S. ambassador, and get that important piece of leadership in place. But I think use a little bit of history here to really underscore democracy, the rule of law, strengthening of institutions. I truly believe, had we not been successful in passing the North American Free Trade Agreement, both here, Canada, and in Mexico, that Mexico would not have continued to look outward and build their democracy. I believe history will judge that. And the institutions within the region, while not as strong as we might like, have been pretty remarkably resilient and sturdy in some challenging times in Mexico and more broadly. And I personally was a champion of updating the North American Free Trade Agreement. After all, Al Gore had not invented the internet when we passed the kiddingly so. But the vice president was very, very much ahead of his time on both the environment and technology. But my point is, it needed updating, just like any business agreement or trade agreement does, and it was. But I think we've got to find common ground with Mexico where we can, and frankly, where we don't agree, try to minimize the friction there or disagreements, because the relationship is critically important to us, and even in many ways more important to the Mexicans. And I think President Lopez Obrador understands that. You know, the value of the peso, the interest rates, all of that, crucial to Mexico's stability and well-being.
It does seem indeed that NAFTA was a real contributor toward building of Mexico's democratic institutions. And so I personally would like to congratulate both of you for that foresight when you were in your respective government positions, Secretary, of course, at the United Nations at that time, but promoting NAFTA, promoting the trade agenda as really a way to open up economies and therefore support democracies. Really something that we oftentimes forget about, and just I think worth reiterating. Mack, thank you very much. That was very timely intervention. Madam Secretary, to the extent you had a comment on Mexico, would love to get that. If not, we can move on.
Well, I do think that it is an essential relationship. And one of the things Mack said, I so agree with. There's nothing wrong with updating an agreement. And there were things that we weren't able to do at the time. And besides, the situation has changed. But you mentioned that I was at the UN at the time, which I was. And it was terrific to be able to do something which was, I started a NAFTA group up there with the Canadian and Mexican ambassadors. It was very helpful. And then later we all became foreign ministers, frankly. And I raised that because we were talking about the importance of Canada and seeing us as being able to help each other on a lot of these issues. The Mexican issue is clearly complex in terms of the number of issues. But I also do sense from this initial statement that came out from the virtual meeting that there is a desire to work together and problem solve and not kind of take the low ground saying, you know, we can't do anything together, but recognizing that there are important issues. But it is a vital relationship, obviously.
Absolutely. Madam Secretary, you at one point were America's chief diplomat. And so the question comes through, how has the role and practice of diplomacy changed in the modern age with social media? If you were secretary again, how would you employ the tools of the modern age in terms of communication? And to the extent you can wrap that into the democracy promotion agenda, it would be very, very worthwhile, I think. Just
to tell you how things changed, when I was Secretary of State, I invented something really new, which was the telephone conference call. Yeah. And the part that was interesting was then later that it took a while for information to come in from the embassies through cable traffic. And in the operations center at the State Department, the people there would be sitting there watching CNN. So technology really has had a huge effect on foreign policy. And one of the hard parts, frankly, which both you and Mack know from experience is, and now information comes in so quickly that you don't have time to think about whether it's true or not, or how you even respond to it. So it really has affected diplomacy in a number of different ways. And I think the hard part generally is trying to figure out how we as any society work with the information that we know not to be true, and how you assess it. But the fact that the technology works so fast makes it very hard for the diplomats to be able to really do their job in explaining what is being literally the eyes and ears of your own government. But it has affected it. It will continue to affect it even more, I think, as we try to sort out what the rules are about social media. And also because countries have very different rules about privacy, you know, and what you decide you need to take off or on. So this is an ongoing and very complex issue. And it's definitely when, as NDI, for instance, we now have a whole technology and democracy arm that really looks at how technology and democracy can improve things rather than create echo chambers where people don't know what the information really is, and then take political action that is inappropriate as a result of it.
Yeah, the rules have changed. There's no question about it. Your comments very well made as always, Mack. don't know if you have a thought or comment on the digital agenda, but perhaps maybe a quick comment, but also then to a point that you have raised many times very effectively that's come in from one of our audience members. You know, we talk a lot about an emerging Latin America agenda based on the increasingly important, of course, it's always been important, but increasingly recognized Latino voice in the United States, Hispanic voice in the United States. But there does seem to be sometimes a disconnect from some of the domestic issues and some of the foreign policy issues. And the question is, does this portend a greater U.S. interest in Western Hemisphere issues going forward? Is there a way to think about these issues, linking them perhaps from the business agenda or something else?
Yes, I think there is, and I think we've already seen some of that, Eric, in terms of just simply consumer habits, taste, preferences, and so forth. So I think you already are seeing that in a natural business sense, economic sense. But I think to go back on a couple of points to what the Secretary said, I mean, I think the point about the digital world and capital flows underscore that we are more interconnected, not less. And therefore, relationships in our own neighborhood, backyard, region are, you just have to conclude, are more crucial than ever. So that to me is kind of the cornerstone of how you move forward on relationships within the region, hopefully encapsulating some of the other points we made about the individual nature of the countries and so forth. Eric, the other point I would make is something you and I have talked about. We are going, and Madeleine spoke, as she always does, eloquently and thoughtfully about it in her opening comments. We're going to have to demonstrate a better ability for us to govern in this country and for us to come together in a much more effective manner and be able, that compromise is not a dirty word, and be able to govern. We're seeing that. What's encouraging, but also discouraging. We are seeing that time and time again at state levels where you have divided government of Republicans and Democrats. And two of the most popular governors in our country right now are Republican governors in very blue states, Maryland with Larry Hogan and Charles Baker in Massachusetts. So it's not that in that kind of environment, admittedly much smaller, less diverse than the United States, but you do see an effective ability to govern. And we're going to have to accomplish that if we're going to continue to be in a leadership position in this region and more broadly.
Absolutely. Well, our time is rapidly coming near the end, so let me give the same question to both of you if I can. And it's one that I think is really an interesting one that's come in over the transom. Frank Fukuyama wrote about the end of history back a generation or so ago at the end of the Cold War. And many of us have used that sort of phraseology to assume the ultimate ascension of democracy. But we've obviously had to rethink some of that over the last several years, certainly this century. And I wonder, Madam Secretary, you've written several books on this topic, of course, and many other things. What do we have to do to ensure that the end of history is actually democratic? Are we assuming the right assumptions? Or are there things that we have to do to really change course so that when we do get to the end of history, quote unquote, it is a democratic one?
Well, first of all, I don't think we'll ever end history. But the whole point, though, is that we need to understand much more what the basis of democracy is, instead of just kind of quoting slogans or, thinking that we know what it is. And I do think that one of the things that has really happened, just to go way back, is that people gave up their individual rights in order to have some protection from a state or a king. It's the social contract. And the bottom line that has happened is it is not being observed properly by either side. There are questions about how much the state could or should do or interfere or how it operates. And then the people, many of them are not active participants in making sure that democracy works. And it isn't just the vote. It is understanding what the issues are. But I do think that the economics and the divisions that are taking place, we have to understand that we can't all have exactly the same thing, but we can't forget about those who don't have something. I think also we need to understand all of a sudden something that is new. History is based on the nation state, and there are now what we call non-state actors who have a role, and we haven't figured out how to deal with them in the international system or regionally. And so there are an awful lot of challenges, but they can't be undertaken only by people that are sitting in, isolated places, but really as a result of discussions with people with whom you disagree. So when Mack points out a Republican governor in a Democratic blue state, I think there has to be some empathy and kind of figuring out what is needed. Democracy is hard. And as we both have said, it has to deliver, and it is not a spectator sport.
Very well said. And Mack, we'll give you the final word to the extent you care to exercise it. And in that context, building on what the Secretary just said, would there be any guidance, maybe that's not the right word, but thoughts about how these issues apply to the Western Hemisphere from your perspective, things that we should carry away from us as this conversation comes to a close?
Yeah. Well, I think Secretary Albright remarks were just powerful. I mean, they were thoughtful, eloquent, and they were frank. They were candid. So I would not be able to do anything other than affirm that and to thank Madeleine for her usual leadership. What I would say, Eric, to kind of close us out here is I do think there's a sense of urgency here. I think this is an inflection point in our relationship within the region and more broadly. I think President Biden clearly understands that, as does his key leadership team more broadly. We're coming out of the coronavirus. This is a time to get very serious, focused, sobered, confident, but humble, and act. I think secondly, in terms of the challenges and kind of the fractured nature we feel, I would go a bit to the human spirit and values of freedom and just the natural sense of well-being and relationships with other people and particularly family and loved ones. What you see in America is a great outpouring of wonderful acts of kindness, compassion, and competence day in and day out. What we're not seeing is a coherence in terms of our national unity. There's the disconnect, in my view. And that's what we've got to make our democracy stronger and work better. I still go back to some of the themes, frankly, that were put forward by President Clinton and others of providing opportunity, but also in keeping with Madeleine's comments, responsibility from an individual standpoint and a sense of community. Those are the pillars of our democracy. And where it applies to the region, I think if we can demonstrate some of that and get on a much better track here, that will resonate with our friends in the region. And that's what will help catalyze, engage relationships there that we'll have to really build on trust and consistent interface and communication. So those are my best thoughts, Eric, as we meet today. Thank you for a skilled hand. I would say that you're trained well, but you came very well trained when you first worked together in the White House.
Well, it's been my privilege indeed. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time, ladies and gentlemen, and now you know why. What a terrific discussion from two of the leading practitioners on these issues literally around the world today. Unfortunately, there are a number of questions we just didn't have time to get to. So I guess that means we'll have to have you both back at some point to continue the conversation. We would be honored to do so. But this discussion met and indeed exceeded all expectations. So thank you to both of you sincerely for joining us, for your transparency, your open comments, your thoughtfulness, your willingness to engage on some very complicated issues, and to take a stand in favor of some issues that directly affect the United States and our relations in the Western Hemisphere and around the world. I want to thank Susan Siegel again and all of you for joining us. This will conclude our program. We hope to see you very soon again at the Council of the Americas, hopefully before too long in person. And until that time, be safe, be well, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
Joy and a privilege, Madeleine.
Thank you. Thank